Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Welcome, everybody, to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris. I'm a husband, a father, a pastor, and strategic therapeutic mentor to leaders in all spheres of influence. Today's episode, I'm going solo and sharing a personal point of celebration and the vision of Red Ink Revival, and most of all, how you can engage the value proposition we offer. We exist to create a leadership revival through the heart, soul, and brain of Christian leaders. Red Ink Revival is an ecosystem of therapeutic leadership experiences and resources to revive the soul for greater impact in every sphere of life, including our relationships, marriages, parenting, callings, assignments, our commission, and then life ministry goals. Red is about redemption. All of our stories are impacted by pains, difficulties, and injury. You can't live as a human in this fallen world and escape it. But Christ made our stories a part of his redemption, and we don't have to stay the way that we are or the way that we were. We can grow and express the glory of God. Ink is about emotional identity. It's where we form our core beliefs, the things that arouse us to action, and how we crave and what we crave in life. Ink is the tattoo on our souls of how we see ourselves, how we see God, and how we see others, how we actually interpret our place in the world around us. And then a revival is all about renewed life, spiritually, emotionally, neurobiologically, and physically. Healthy leaders, get this, will produce healthy followers, right? And then dysfunctional leaders, well, they're going to produce dysfunctional followers. At Red Ink Revival, we are a team of psychologists and therapists. We love helping pastors and leaders rediscover you, redefine leadership, redeem life, redream what ministry is all about through our life-changing leadership, personal growth, and emotional wholeness experiences. Our platform is targeted to pastors, church staff, marketplace leaders, and local churches at large. As a senior pastor myself of over 35 years, I often address pastors straight up. However, our heart and focus is a revival for anybody who wants to grow in leadership health, no matter the spheres of influence that they have gone into and that they lead in. And so today I'm going to be sharing about how we are developing transformational resources for pastors, church staffs, marketplace leaders, school teachers, and really so much more. But first, I want to give you guys a huge announcement and why I'm talking about vision today. On August the 8th, my wife Tina and I stepped in to full-time vocational focus of Red Ink Revival. This is really a dream come true that began all the way back in 2015. 4 years later, in 2019, after the Lord had begun to speak to us about a platform, we hosted our first pastor's retreat that literally blew us away. We heard stories, and still today, even months and a few years later, from our alumni, they look back at the week as a revolutionary catalyst to their lives and the fruitfulness in their ministries. As you can imagine, we've prayed, Tina and I, we have planned on how in the world we would transition from the church we planted in 2001, how we would move from being the lead pastors of a church that we care deeply about, Life Point Church of Kansas City, and then again on August the 8th, we merged our church with a great church called Hope Point Church, and then we are now able to focus completely at Red Ink Revival while still holding speaking duties at the new merged church as pastors emeritus. The transition is really a huge part of our calling and assignment. And I just want to invite all of you from the Red Ink tribe to celebrate it with us, to feel what we feel, to see what we see, to hear what we hear. We are celebrating in anticipation of what God is about to do in our new church, the Merge Church, and at Red Ink Revival. And we do believe that multiplication on all fronts is right in front of us. Well, let me begin this whole episode with a little bit of context and background of Red Ink Revival. It all really begins with my own story because from childhood to adulthood, I actually struggled with panic attacks. I didn't know that's what I was experiencing. It just was normal. It's what I had. I dealt with a lot of ruminating, looping, tormenting narratives on the inside that questioned my own sense of self and identity. It's crazy because as a pastor, as I grew from a child into my high school years, my gifts began to emerge, and I began to discover that these gifts gave me kind of currency and relationship and value, and I loved the feeling of that. I loved not only the cross-section of the anointing and the grace of God and partnering with the Holy Spirit, the purity that is in all of that, but I also loved the feeling that my gifts were making a difference. So I'm 16 years old, and this stuff is all coming online. It's coming alive in me, and not really knowing that the panic that would surge through my veins and in my brain and in my whole body, it would sometimes hijack me. And again, I could just have finished even later, some years later, preaching in a conference or what was called a camp meeting or in a seminar or doing a Bible college. And I would give it my heart and soul and fully present, bold and confident. And then the residue afterwards in my hotel room or driving away, flying on an airplane to my next meeting, just ruminating, tormenting anxieties. Some of the panic attacks got so bad that at night I would a few times feel like my brain turned to jelly. I was so fearful of rejection, betrayal, people not being interested in me, feelings of would I be exploited? And so in the process, I went to a leadership environment, kind of a school. It's an intensive for which I went 18 months, and every quarter I would spend 35, 40 hours just being fire hosed. And one of the generational leaders of our time was hosting us, and they all talked about the importance of a pastor having a therapist. And it wasn't something that I had a background in. And so I was a little hesitant, but this particular generational leader had a meltdown in the early 90s and actually had to take a year off from ministry as a result of the psychological, cracks that he had come to see and know. And so they're all making a big deal out of pastors needing to process and metabolize. So I called up his secretary and said, hey, who's his psychologist? I'll go see them. And so I ended up seeing them, and I got some help, and I'm so grateful for the help that I got. And if you know me, you know that I have a high value on psychologists and therapists, people who've given their life to help people deconstruct the pain points and what's happened and help them see even in smaller segments, breaking down the bigger pie to smaller slices to say, hey, let's look at this and see what is here. I appreciate that deeply. But for me in my story, the psychologist that I saw actually 3 or 4 different therapists, and I had books assigned to me, and I appreciate kind of the love and the help that I did get there. But it was incremental. It was incremental help to me. And I, through a series of crazy events, was invited into a certification program to be an addiction professional with the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals with an expertise in sexual addiction. Now, you may be wondering, what's the fascination with sexual addiction? Well, there was a part of me that knew that if I understood the sexual side of a human, and more specific, even me, that actually I could understand so much about me. I think about how Jesus said, about money. Where your treasure is, there will be your heart also. That's also true of our sexuality. Nothing touches our sense of self and our identity more than sex and money. In fact, what we have learned through research and what we've learned through tons and tons of case studies is that there is a massive parallel between what arouses a person financially and what arouses them even sexually. And so for me, I was just blown away for the opportunity to go into a program that I was told was a master's level program of seeing things, knowing things, understanding what is driving human behavior. And literally, I'm in these hours and hours. I think we had about 140 hours total. And I was just like a kid in a candy store, just so overwhelmed as Scripture was coming alive to me. I began to understand things about human behavior that I wasn't privileged to prior. And the organization that I'm talking about, the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals, it is not a religious organization, secular. However, the biblical background, the theology that I had grown in over my life, all of a sudden began to have different vantage points, different aspects, different radiances. And I just was blown away as all of a sudden things in me began to become healthy. I'm required to do exercises in the program, and it's bringing wholeness and health to me. And so from all that I began to understand about trauma reprocessing, neurosequencing, what's going on to drive my emotions to my behaviors, I began to experience wholeness. And I today have not had a panic attack in years. I've had some anxiety begin, and then I began to engage the tools to help manage my body and manage my brain. And I began to reframe and help understand it. But really, it all goes back to the deeper stories that happened early in my childhood on up. And today, I have this massive passion. I do. I have a compelling desire to help leaders make sense of their stories and to discover what is the historical that they can learn what is driving their hysterical. I want to help people to collect the dots, connect the dots, and correct the dots. And so today, I have created, and along with a team of others, Red Ink Revival Platform. It's a podcast, it's retreats, it's monthlies, it's weekly process groups that we do online. It is one-on-ones. It's just some amazing resources to help create lasting transformation. It isn't just surface level management. It's not just behavior compliance. It is not just discipline to get some kind of outcome. It is actually returning us to shalom, peace, peace in our heart, peace in our souls. All of this is because if you have any studies or research around pastors, and again, if you're a marketplace leader or you're in Christian local churches at large, I so invite you to process this with us. But I'm speaking now directly about pastors. 24% of pastors report that their families resent the church. Think about that. 24%. Can you imagine the impact that has not only on the families, which I have great compassion for, but on the pastor himself or herself? And then 75% of pastors report that they have a significant stress-related crisis going on. 75%. 3 out of 4 are having a significant stress-related crisis going on. 40% have a serious conflict with a parishioner. And when conflicts happen, there are so many dual roles that a pastor holds. A pastor, a friend, a counselor, a boss. And the number of people who in church congregations, they can't get power often anywhere else. And it's not unusual for somebody, it doesn't mean all church members, but for somebody to feel like, I can't say what I want. I don't have the power. I've never had the courage to show up and to speak truth in my closest relationships. But I know I can say whatever I want to the pastor. I can be mad at him. I can explode. And it doesn't really matter because he can't go anywhere. He's got to be above the fray. Well, pastors, many have carried that throughout their entire ministries. And so 70% of pastors report a constant fight with depression or a fear of inadequacy, or having a lower, get this, self-image, a lower self-image now than when they first started. If you are a pastor, I think you can resonate that when you first started, you were ready to, take down Goliath before supper and let's win the world for Christ. But then ministry happens, then people happen, then messes happen. And 77% of pastors, with all the financial stresses, to the stresses of conflicts, to hopes and dreams not being fulfilled, and then carrying it, not processing all that emotional baggage well, what ends up happening is that, again, 77% feel that they don't have a good marriage. 84% say that they wish they had somebody, just somebody, to help carry the weight of it, somebody they can trust and confide in, but they don't have any. In fact, that's not just pastor related, but I think if you look at many people today, they've got, hundreds of people in social media friendship, but do they have one or two or three people that they can digest life with, that they can share, laugh, love, celebrate, and be able to face their own pain with authenticity, to be able to look at their own life with honesty, and somebody that isn't going to judge them. And here's the other part, somebody who isn't going to fix them, somebody that's going to sit with them and love them and see them, and with empathy be able to pull out the things that need to be processed, things that need to be renewed even in the mind. And so we have 90% of pastors carrying all of this weight around, and it's going to show up somewhere. So we have workaholics, 90%, 9 out of 10, work 55 to 75 hours per week. And the question is why? Now, see, I'm a pastor who loves what I do. I love ministry, and so I get it that you can work because it's what you love, but here's a deeper question. Are you escaping something? Are you avoiding something? Is there the need to hyper-perform so that if you could achieve, finally you get the validation and you feel as though you're going to protect the self, the inner part of you that doesn't feel seen, heard, loved, and known. And so you have to get something. You have to, perform a trophy. You got to do something to be able to get it. Well, again, the exploration will help people see that often when we work as much as we work, it's simply because we are striving to gain something we don't think that we have or that we're worthy of right now. So we're not working out of a place of freedom to get to go do it. We're often working to somehow accomplish something, and then that validates that we are worthy. We're important and our life matters. I think about addictions. I think about 11% of pastors struggle with tobacco or smoking. 17% struggle with alcohol and prescription drugs. Then we have 64% that report that they struggle with pornography or some kind of, secret sexual activity. And there's nobody that they can out themselves to. No place is safe. They don't feel like it's safe to talk to people in the church. They don't feel like that they can talk with their competitors, other pastors. And we have this big facade. It's no wonder that often our churches are so unhealthy. So there's these hidden issues like suicides. I mean, it is so heartbreaking to hear the number of pastors, young pastors, tenured pastors, who commit suicide. And even at their funerals, nobody acknowledges it, which further shames the idea of this level of depression. And then, of course, you have the pastors who finally get divorces and what that does in injury to their dreams, their hopes, their sense of self, their families, their kids. I think of what I said a moment ago, the sexual moral failing. I think of leadership style where there's acts of exploitation. It's these dominant, powering over and often leaders don't stop to think that, leaders shouldn't do that. Well, wait, shouldn't? Let's get the should out and let's all of a sudden look into why do we do what we do. A lot of young people, even leaders in churches, staff members, worship leaders, are doing this thing called the destruction of their faith. Maybe that's more accurate, but it's the deconstruction of their faith. And it's certainly great for a person to look at their doubts and with healthy theological, philosophical truths, really go after the analysis of that. But what we find is that people are stuck in deconstruction because, as the great philosopher and theologian J.P. Moreland writes in a conversation that I had with him around these things, he suggests that if it is a rational skepticism a person has about their faith, they should be able to write it down in a couple of sentences and then be able to do research around that to see how viable, see how it's worthy of being true or not true. However, most people, when they are in the deconstruction process, they are riddled with injuries within the church, within their families of origin, and they don't have the ability to write down the exact issue, and they haven't researched it. They just are filled with angst. And so it's an emotional and what we call an attachment injury that has now caused their brains to organize around finding some kind of solution or meaning to it. And a person will often deconstruct their faith out of it. I think of leaders who are often in acts of aggression. I think of, again, issues of financial disorders. I'm amazed at how many pastors struggle with finances. And what we do is we tend to just go to behavior compliance trainings. Financial Peace University, it's dynamic as a training tool. But what if the reason that a person struggles after they've gone to 5 Financial Peace Universities and they still aren't executing? Maybe there's a root system somewhere. Maybe there's a spider that's throwing this cobweb together. And I think it's important to begin to look at the deeper issues. When a person's depressed, maybe the depression isn't circumstantial in the way that it is often thought of. Maybe there is something that's happened in their brain that if we were able to do story work, we could see it and find it. And so I look at the panic attacks, I look at the burnouts, the flame outs, and I think, gosh, I personally, literally, I do. I have such compassion and empathy. Often when I work with pastors or their wives or their staffs, I just get so moved with emotion hearing their stories. And I hate hearing people suffering. And they've done the best they know. They've gone to the best people that they know. But they have never done what we call story work. They've never looked at why they are the way they are. Driven leaders ought to know what they're driven by. And so rather than just focus and kind of become obsessed with the cobweb, shouldn't we look at where the spider is? What's causing this thing over and over? And so again, at Red Ink Revival, we have created a plethora of resources and experiential emotional recovery environments. And our alumni, whether it's a retreat, a 6-week process group online, come back and tell us these amazing testimonies. I'm reading one right in front of me. This person said, during the end of a retreat, I talked to my wife every night during this retreat for hours. She cried, laughed, and sat in silence. And then she said while crying, "This is the greatest miracle of my entire life." And I just want to say, this is somebody that's from a charismatic, Holy Spirit, gifts of the Spirit, miracle believing background. And yet they're saying this is the greatest miracle of my life. Another person said, in 4 days, I've come to feel closer and bonded to these people in this group than I've felt to any other friends I've known for years. Another person said, this is the single greatest conference I have ever been to. Many would report things like, hey, did you know that this is actually a revival? I mean, there's this kind of surprise feeling. Now, it's one thing to get people after they have gone through a retreat and they're living on the high. You know what I'm talking about. The fumes are just full. It's another thing when you see the person a year, 2 years later, and they are in a group of other pastors and somebody asks you about what you do, and then they have a compulsion to tell the impact that has happened in their churches, on their marriages, in their parenting, the way they deal with relationships, how they process their staff, how they now then are thinking behind the eyes of the person they're looking into. They look into, I wonder why that person is doing what they're doing. So many people have talked about how this is life-changing. You may be wondering, well, golly, what's the secret sauce? If all of this is happening at Red Ink Revival, what are you guys doing? What's different? Well, in addiction work, it's so critical that you don't just look at the behaviors, that no behavior is in, kind of a vacuum. No behavior is independent from many other variables. The first and most important thing that a person does in story work is they go into their attachment development. Attachment development, the first stage of what we pull apart, is we look at your family of origin and how your family, your mom, your dad, your siblings were tuned into you. They saw you, they felt you. Now, I don't mean that they, provided for you, or they always had food in the cabinets, or you had clothes on your back. I'm talking about attunement. Whenever you would come home from school, maybe you had bullies that were doing something, saying something, and you were in distress and you came home. Did you turn to your parents? Did you engage them? Did you ask them to engage you? And if you didn't, here's the bigger question. What did your brain early on in the first year of life learn about your parents to organize that whenever you're in distress, this is how you respond? You go to your bedroom, you hide, you handle it yourself. Or maybe you just throw fits, but you're not in a coherent kind of state. You're simply in an attacking and you are falling apart kind of emotional state. You're not able to have somebody lean into you and feel you and see you and sit with you. So what we're talking about in attachment development is how your brain constructed bonds with other relationships. And now maybe you're 40 years old and you're married and your spouse is trying to figure you out. They're like, why do you do that? Why do you get triggered the way you get triggered? Why do you avoid the way you avoid? When something big, some big emotion, big personality comes in, why do you just adapt around it? Why do you not confront it? Why do you not hold it accountable? Or if you hold it accountable, why are you so jacked up? Why do you attack and you're mean and you're harsh? Why? Well, all of this is just implications of an attachment injury or a series of injuries, and really your nervous system being coded, programmed around how your brain organized in relationships. And so at Red Ink Revival, our brand, we love to get into story work. Now you may think, well, is this normal? Well, it is in addiction treatment. But it is not normal in many other therapeutic circles where a therapist has a client and begins to work with them. Often what will happen is because people are in distress, they're given tools that are really good. So I'm not criticizing, but really good tools, but there's never the exploration of the deeper root system. Nobody is looking for the spider. It's let's just help you get some tools to be able to manage the anxiety, to manage the depression in the moment, in the now, rather than actually go in and let's just renovate. Let's create a revival. Let's bring healing to the heart. And so I just recently was talking to somebody who struggled with alcoholism, and they have created a lot of pain in their life from it. They have created injury to their marriage and to their kids because of the alcoholism. And they went to a 30-day inpatient program and then came back, and then every week have been meeting with a therapist. Well, I ask, and this is a common story, I ask, so tell me, have you guys had a chance to do story work? And they said, well, I don't know that I really know what you're asking. And I said, well, have you looked at your family of origin and looked back at what were the impact moments that your brain began to mind map, your brain began to scan and reorganize how that you are going to manage distress? Have you gone into story work to see that? They said, none of that. I said, have you done any trauma work? Have you done a trauma egg? Have you, and I mean, I'm using these pro terms that are common within the industry, and they're saying, no, we've never done any of that. And I got to be honest, that just makes me want to, let's just be transparent. It makes me want to yell. It makes me want to scream. I just want to beat my head against the wall about why? And so while I want to just celebrate those that are getting help in any area and so much celebrate therapy, and I also want to say that if we're not digging into the power of story, we're actually not finding the spider that created the web. And so we're in this cycle of what ends up in whatever, anxiety, depression, rage, and maybe addiction and some of the other outlying kind of actions. We end up simply being in a binge purge. We, find ourselves, and often we think, man, I've got everything under control. But then when we least expect it, it's the root of bitterness. Hebrews 12, 14, and 15. The root of bitterness, the trauma of our past, coding into our nervous system, our brains. All of a sudden, the root of bitterness springs up. You didn't see it coming. Bam! And then it troubles you, it excites you, incites you, it annoys you, and then you're irritable. And then the next part is it defiles you. It causes you to be skewed in your perception of self, of God, of other relationships, of just this fallen world that we live in, circumstances. You have this trauma. It's bitter. And you know what it's like when you drink something bitter. If it's really bitter and you either bit into it or you drank it, you think I'm prepared for this. I know everybody says it's sour, it's bitter. I know, but you take it and immediately you have this visceral. Your whole body begins to get into shakes, and then you jump up and down and you can't control it. Well, that's what grief, loss, and trauma does in a root of bitterness. It springs up, it troubles, it defiles. So we love to go back into the trauma work, and in doing it, we find out what are the core beliefs that a person has. These are the unconscious identity beliefs that we have developed, and they're not our cognitive or our rational doctrinal beliefs, our theological beliefs. Jesus talked about the distinction of believing with the heart versus believing just in a mental kind of adherence. This is critical, and the believing with the heart, because out of the heart flows all the issues of life. In it, we find what is arousing to us in terms of how we move in behavior. This is where survival and belonging begins to happen. It's the interpersonal limbic brain beliefs. And so we love to, begin to look at what those are. because they give us clues and keys into the attachment injuries. And then we love to move into the third stage, which is the body and emotion management, or what the pros, the industry, would call it affect regulation. This is where you have biological and emotional states and cognitive underpinnings. This is where hyperarousal, hypoarousal is just how do you manage in the moment topically, rather than getting down to where the spider is, how do I deal with the emotion in this very moment? It's not about the deeper healing of the driver. It's actually how do I manage right now? And, there's things that are amazing tools. Neuroscience shows us today that sleep is critically important to the brain for emotional health and wholeness. Light, the way you manage light in the morning, triggers certain neurochemicals in the brain that prepare you for even later in the evening, although it's morning, prepare you later in the evening for being able to sleep well. If you have certain lights in the evening, what will end up happening is it affects different neurochemicals that actually keep you from going into deep sleep. Food does the same thing. Even as we look at dialectical behavior therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, this is where we look at distress tolerance, mindfulness, we look at interpersonal effectiveness. We find ourselves thinking through what is it that is the event that just happened? How did this event trigger an emotion? What's the narrative below the emotion? And what's the meaning that I emotionally have tied to that? And as we begin to do the exercises, before long, you get your reps in and you begin to build a brand new muscle that helps you know that your thinking is affecting how you feel and act, and behaviors end up, affecting how you act and think, and how your emotions begin to show you the feeling and the action. So what you end up doing is you begin to search and know yourself, know the state of your heart, know the state of your mind. And we love then being able to help people live in a brand new, transformed approach to life, managing emotions, managing marriage, managing leadership. New behaviors come out of it. And then what's crazy as a leader, if you're a pastor, one of the beautiful things is you begin to scan for this with anybody who comes to you dysregulated with emotional bigness. They're flooded, and you're able to not take it personal. You're able then to be differentiated. You're allowing them to have their experience without judgment, but you're also able to serve them without being able to take or be enmeshed and codependent to feel like I'm responsible for how they feel. No, you're feeling it. I'm not. I can be empathetic and feel it by virtue of a choice, but I can't be empathetic if I'm enmeshed. Because I'm enmeshed, I'm now then having to feel what you feel. And this is, again, a big issue around areas of leadership. And so at Red Ink Revival, we're helping people become wholehearted. And what we're developing, which I'm so excited about, and I invite you to see it, hear it, know it, is we are developing things like regional pastor staff roundtables. Would love to work with churches and their staff to do story work with them. It doesn't require anybody to tell stuff that they don't want to tell. Usually when people hear that, they're like, well, I don't want to do story work with anybody that's somebody I know. That's way too vulnerable. I get it. But you don't have to, kind of expose yourself in any way that you don't want. You have the steering wheel, your foot's on the accelerator pedal, your foot's on the brake. You can decide what you want to say or not say. And many of the things we would do in a group, a bigger group, is that it would be through worksheets. I would guide you through it. There would be some interaction, but it would not be as intense that you could go into with a process group. Those would come at another time if somebody so desired it. But we have, of course, our podcast, which you're listening to now. We have monthly Zooms for pastors and spouses. We have weekly process groups where I go 6 weeks online through Zoom to be able to work through attachment issues, work through cognitive behavioral issues, so many different modules that we can pull apart that our alumni report are some of the biggest, most life-changing experiences they've ever had. We have retreat experiences. Again, psychologists and therapists are there to help work through the stories of people in group. We have addiction recovery intensives for the church at large. Doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. We do try to put pastors in pastors groups so that they are hanging out with people of like precious faith and like seasons of life. We do one-on-one coaching. I do one-on-one coaching. We do marriage coaching. We do financial coaching, and the financial coaching begins with my wife, Tina, who is a certified financial coach. She is brilliant. She's amazing at the work she does. You hear about the ads on the podcast. But we also look at what is in the emotional spending, the drivers behind the financial spending. And then one of my favorite things that we are in the process of developing is Red Ink University. Red Ink University is where we're developing e-courses that are on demand. And I'm contracting with neuroscientists, theologians, psychologists to help us not just have, some entertainment, but actually be equipped so that we ultimately can be trained and certified in the Red Ink story brand, in the Red Ink brand of story work. And that pastors and church staff leaders can be trained and certified so they understand what happened in the brain, the impact of trauma and loss and grief, and even how to deal with grief and what to do with certain emotions, and how theology needs to be the foundation behind all that we do. But neuroscience can give color commentary and different vantage points and radiances to what we've read in the inerrant scripture. We also are developing website resources. Books are going to be published in the months and years to come. I'm going to continue to guest speak. And then we would love Red Ink Revival to be able to be put into local churches, that we would be able to create a user-friendly access point so that entire churches could go through this. And I promise you that if people in your churches understand the thing that we're talking about, the health of marriages, the kind of inordinate behaviors, the maladaptive stuff that people can't manage, and they end up embarrassing themselves and their church, and you as a pastor are like, would they just stop it? And it's like, well, they generally they could, but they don't know what's happening. And so if we can equip them with why they do what they do, we can help them to become healthy and whole, not just disciplined. It's a big difference. And so we believe that there's an opportunity for a revival all over the world. We have had prophecies over Red Ink Revival that resonate with my heart, and I don't have any pressure to make any of it happen. I'm happy to work with one person at a time, groups of 6, but we are giving God every opportunity. We're stepping out in faith in massive ways, and some of the prophecies, here's one, I'm reading it, that Red Ink Revival will affect nations and generations. It will touch every nation around the world. There won't be one nation or generation that hasn't been touched by it. Another one speaking about our heart, and it says that there's an apostolic and even prophetic mantle, and it's about to take the message of addiction recovery and leadership mental health and set the generations of the nations free. The message is going to provide a level of access to people that will be incalculable, incalculable. There it is. And then another one, there was a prophecy of a friend that said, just as we've seen Dave Ramsey set hundreds of thousands of people free who've been in bondage financially, Red Ink is significant for Christ's body right now. Well, again, I don't feel any pressure around that, but I invite you as the Red Ink family. I invite you to be in prayer, believing with us, and expecting, in fact, engaging. Take the risk to engage your story, to begin to learn what happened in you. And we'll walk it out with you. And we have some of the greatest experts in psychology and therapeutic work and theology that have committed, that they're available and want to help us to help you. And so in our Red Ink Revival team of people, we have opportunities. In fact, I want to offer to you that if you're a pastor or a paid staff member, I'd be happy. If you're a pastor or a paid staff member, I'd be personally happy to offer you a free 30-minute consultation. If you're a marketplace leader, or just somebody searching for support, I do have paid blocks of time for a 30-minute consultation. And I just think about the Apostle Paul when he stood in front of King Agrippa, and he made this statement: I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. And that is our heart. And I would love for every pastor who hears this to go on a journey with us, and let's see what God might do through all of us. I just want you to know Tina and I would find it a privilege to serve you. Our whole team would. And so we hold you with honor and grace, and we can't wait until we get to see you again, hopefully real soon. God bless you guys.